think I have this down.
Yeah, you have enough practice for Monday. Well, and all of the other times you've done it, but
Yeah, it's very repetitive.
I was looking at your instructions, Scott, like when you sent over the web stuff, and I'm gonna try and
Yeah.
teach myself how to do
I
this.
turn on my camera. I was going to turn on my camera so I can wave to Maddie. Hi.
If you don't do it to the custom URL, it's actually really easy. You just hit one button,
Nice.
but you
Okay.
just need to make sure you're logged into the right Google account.
Okay.
But let me,
Yeah. We're gonna have this is one of the like monthly free ones.
and that's what Town Hall does because they do their own live streams. They just do it directly
Nice.
to the YouTube page, and then
Yeah.
you're saved. It's basically the same process.
Okay.
Maddie,
Okay.
are you able
Like to make me
to?
attendee?
Thanks,
Are you
Scott.
able to unmute me?
Yeah, you should be,
Well,
Brian.
well,
I just
not
made you a
unmuted,
co-host now. So you should be able to. Scott, I'll bounce you to an attendee. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks.
There we go. Change the hotspot because I was not on it. Okay, now we're good. Oh, that's the question. I mean, if you wanted to be just in the what? Are we doing something different than the regular tour?
No,
Oh, okay, you just have that whole screen. Okay.
no, this is just more for people. I'm going to start the webinar now, so that they come in and see this versus just seeing you and me. So I figured
Oh
this
yeah.
was...
It looks really blurry for some reason.
Oh, really? Okay.
Right? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's the way it's buffering or something. Yeah, I honestly, I think if you want to be around like seeing or listening, but just like if it looks like there's other staff or people in the exhibit, that's
Okay, Brian, I'm gonna mute you guys for just a second because I'm gonna let people in now. Are you using the hotspot, Brian? You just kind of froze a little bit, and I'm not sure if it was you or me. That looks better.
okay. It for some reason booted me back to the staff Wi-Fi account and
Okay.
not the hotspot. I don't know why it did that. So it seemed like we lagged there. We have the hotspot because
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Constitution Center. My name is Madison. I'm a member of the center's education team, and I'm so excited to welcome you to one of our virtual tours. We're going to be taking a look at one of our newer galleries, the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Battle for Freedom and Equality. We are super excited to offer you this tour. Just a couple of days ago, we celebrated Juneteenth, our nation's second Independence Day. So this exhibit tour is a wonderful opportunity to learn about the events leading up to the Civil War itself, and how we see the promises of the Declaration of Independence finally written into the Constitution by way of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We are going to get started in just a minute, but I want to welcome everyone. Do me a favor and test out that chat feature. Feel free to open it up and let us know where you're tuning in from, who you are tuning in with, and what you are looking forward to seeing on this virtual tour. We're very excited to have you all here, and love that we're able to share this amazing exhibit with all of you. We've got about 1 minute until we get started, and then we're going to go ahead and begin.
wonderful.
Oh, hello, Denver, Colorado. Very nice. Welcome,
All right.
Michael.
Hello,
Very
Michael.
exciting. I see we've got some folks from Pennsylvania, some from New Jersey. Very exciting. Well, it's about time that we go ahead and get started. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleague at the National Constitution Center, Brian. And Brian is going to take us on a virtual tour of the National Constitution Center's exhibit, Civil War and Reconstruction, the Battle for Freedom and Equality. These monthly virtual tours of the Civil War exhibit are courtesy of TD Bank. So a huge thank you to TD Bank for sponsoring this virtual tour. And you can tune in monthly for these virtual tours. Just check out constitutioncenter.org where you can find all of our online offerings. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who is going to lead us through this amazing exhibit. Brian, take it away.
Thank you, Madison. Really excited to be able to talk to our friends today. As you said, this is a great week to talk about it, especially in the wake of the Juneteenth holiday, because that really is a great celebration of some of the events and, well, one particular event, and the culmination of a lot of the advocacy of folks, at least in this first room of this exhibit, for generations. So I do want to welcome you to our exhibit, The Civil War and Reconstruction, the Battle for Freedom and Equality. There's a lot to see in this space, so I want to make sure that I give us plenty of time to explore and share a bit of information with you folks. That said, when we dive into that story to talk about the American Civil War, we actually have to go back quite a ways. In fact, we have our Building to Crisis section here looks at 1787 to 1860. And I suspect my friends who are joining us for Constitution Center programming are familiar with why we would start with 1787. What would that be? Well, you may know, of course, that that is the Constitutional Convention, right? The gathering of delegates, 55 men from 12 states, gather in Philadelphia, in Independence Hall at the committee room, from May to September of 1787. This convention helped to hammer out a new governing document for the United States of America. And among the compromises the delegates make, there are several related to the institution of slavery, which had been widespread throughout essentially all of the original 13 colonies, some places more than others, but prior to the Revolution, slavery exists in some form or another throughout the United States. About 1 in 5 Americans are enslaved. Or in that first census, it's 18% of all Americans are enslaved. But we are seeing changes happening at this time. Here in Pennsylvania, a gradual abolition law is passed in 1780. Massachusetts, in that same decade, has a court decision which weakens or strikes down the institution of slavery. Many other northern states in the ensuing decades likewise passed largely gradual abolition acts where upon a certain age, folks may be free or after attaining a certain age. And so the country becomes more and more divided geographically. Even in 1787, the Northwest Ordinance would set out and say that lands north of the Ohio River, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, slavery is prohibited there. But the other thing in 1787 is the convention reaches a few agreements about slavery without using the word. It'll say in the infamous 3/5 clause that when we're counting all people in the United States, including that 1 in 5 who are enslaved, we count 3/5 of all other persons. We count all free persons and 3/5 of all other persons. They don't use the word slavery or enslaved, but if you're not a free person, what else would you be? Later in Article 1, the powers of the legislative branch of Congress, there's a line about people, about the migration or importation of such persons as the states now existing think proper to admit. I think I got that language right there, folks. I always try to get my constitutional quotes. But that one says that the government could not ban the Atlantic slave trade until 1808. And even in Article 5, that Congress cannot amend the Constitution to give itself the power to abolish the Atlantic slave trade before 1808. And then the third reference in Article 4 would say that people who are held to service or labor are not, and it uses the word escaping They are not released from their service or labor by entering another state. What kind of job could you not quit and move away from? So there are a lot of references there, and some of these are seen as really significant protections for the institution of slavery. But folks around the country are opposed to this. Nevertheless, there's a growing abolition movement. A number of the artifacts here really highlight the ways in which Americans seek to take on the institution of slavery. Some measures is by publishing books, fiction and nonfiction, narratives like the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, or in the case beside me here, his first edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. There are other texts that are targeted for different audiences. In the case beside, where that gentleman is taking a look at, is The Slave's Friend, a magazine published in Philadelphia in the 1830s, targeting the children, the young people, to help raise them to be abolitionists. There's even some texts that are for the littlest abolitionists. Above Frederick Douglass here, you might see there's a little letters K and L. These are excerpts from a book called The Anti-Slavery Alphabet. You can learn your ABCs and learn to combat slavery at the same time. Some feel that this is the way we can do it, through education, through legislation, through acts of Congress, voting, and great public effort. Frederick Douglass and others believe that we can do this. Let the North make the Constitution bend to the cause of freedom and justice. Others, like William Lloyd Garrison, kind of have a different view of what the Constitution is, or how it could be used, or if it could be used. That's a pretty famous quote right there, a covenant with death. What a bold statement there. So there's a division of what can we do to challenge. And it's really important and seen as really urgent to be able to challenge this too. Because I don't know if you've heard this before, folks, but I know some folks will talk about slavery going away or declining on its own. And I mentioned some northern states that had passed gradual abolition laws. But if you take a look at the map along the wall behind me, this is the census data from 1860, showing county by county in those states where slavery remains legal, what percentage of all living persons. There are parts of Virginia counties where 72, 74% of all people are enslaved. The neighboring counties to Washington, D.C., Prince George County, Maryland, over 56% of people who live there. And if I have a table to go show you folks down here too, we can see that there are 6 states with 43% or higher of their population enslaved. And that is 6 states higher than the highest state in 1790. The 18% of all people in America were enslaved when the Constitution goes into effect, really. And the highest is South Carolina, about 43% of people. By 1860, it's flipped. Less than 43% of people who live there are free. There are 2 states where the majority of their population are enslaved. So this is a country that is becoming increasingly divided. If anyone really wants to look at that, Madison, I believe we have a link of this to get a better view of that map, to see it for yourself, because I always love a map as a great way to visualize this data and show where we are at. Now, one thing I want to point out, blocked a little bit by the case here, is that that southern border of Missouri. Over the course of the 1800s, as the nation grows and changes, as the institution of slavery becomes more starkly divided between North and South, the government takes many steps to try to address this, to try to keep this balance and maintain the peace. The Missouri Compromise would say that the southern border of Missouri is a dividing between free and slave territory. Later on, acts would say that some territories would be subject to popular sovereignty, that the people who live there may be able to vote. And the nation is perpetually in the grip of how do we maintain peace and keep this country united at the same time that we are so deeply divided on this fundamental issue. And it really comes to a head in the case of these folks here. Dred and Harriet Scott, and maybe we've heard of the Dred Scott decision before, one of the most infamous decisions by the Supreme Court. This was an attempt to really settle this question once and for all. Chief Justice Taney weighing in. We have the quote from him here. But in this particular case, Dred and Harriet Scott, who'd been enslaved in Missouri, were transported to Minnesota Territory from Fort Snelling They had been essentially hired out as laborers up there. They had been married up there. Their daughters had been born in the north, their oldest daughter born on a riverboat between Iowa and Illinois. And they felt after the death of Dr. Emerson, the slaveholder, that they could be returned south, returned to Missouri, and face the potential breakup of their family if they were treated like property to be divided up among heirs. So the Scots take their case to court. And their case makes its way over the course of 11 years to the Supreme Court in 1857. Their arguments that there was no documents about Harriet Scott being transferred in ownership or likewise the rights of their daughters, arguments made about the way they were treated, that they'd remained north and more. Ultimately, the court says that regardless, they didn't have any legal standing, that even if they were free, they could never be citizens, that they had no rights a white man was bound to respect. And so the court makes a really, in Justice Kennedy, makes a really bold statement of who is and who can be and cannot be part of we the people. Rather than settling the question, however, it only divides the country even further. A fellow member of the Supreme Court, Justice Benjamin Curtis, disagrees. He says that he feels everyone, every free person, mind you, who is born in the soil of a state is a citizen of that state and the United States. It's a much more, we think, of modern idea of what makes someone an American. And these are really two ideas that can't be squared with each other, that everyone who is born here is a citizen, or that some people by their race alone can never be part of that we the people and are excluded. Before I move on, I did want to give us a good look. We have this petition for freedom for Dred Scott, and because it can highlight a little bit of the legal status of enslaved people too, and the treatment they would have faced. So this document is essentially spelling out his case, and we have his name at the bottom here. Whoops. But you might see in the middle of Dred Scott, there is his mark, because throughout many states, it is illegal to teach or for enslaved people to learn to read or write. And so Dred Scott himself was not literate. And so he would have to indicate that he understood what that argument, what that case was about, and that he approved of that and was consenting to bring this case to the court. He would have made his mark, that cross, that X, in the midst of where his name had been written. Now, it's in this time of division, of these split over federal court cases and even over things like the John Brown raid. And we see John Brown here attempting to lead an armed insurrection, a rebellion of enslaved people. The country is increasingly divided. And that's the time when Mr. Lincoln is elected. Abraham Lincoln here. This is a portrait by David Bustle Bowser, a African-American artist, portraitist, depicting President Lincoln. This one would have been painted likely in his second term or late in his first term in office as president. And Lincoln here, this is well into his term as president. However, he was something of a dark horse, an underdog candidate. He's just the second nominee ever of the relatively new Republican Party. And he was not really a front runner at their convention in 1860. He had kind of come to national prominence in 1858 during an unsuccessful campaign for the US Senate against Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois, who had really supported that popular sovereignty idea, letting new states, new territories, Western territories vote on whether or not they would have slavery. Lincoln felt the federal government could not end slavery where it existed in the existing states, but it could prevent its expansion into the West. Lincoln gives that famous speech, even saying that he feels the House divided against itself cannot stand, that the country could not endure half slave and half free. And some states, some supporters of the institution of slavery remember that quote. Lincoln is elected president in a widespread really wild election in which there are two Democratic nominees. There's a Constitutional Union Party nominee as well, John Bell, and Lincoln ends up winning the Electoral College vote and getting about 41% of the national popular vote. He is congratulated. He has a cast of his hands in the case here. Love to show this, folks, as well as a campaign ribbon as well, which looks a little bit different because Abe has no beard in this image here. This cast of his hands was taken after he had shaken so many folks' hands upon being congratulated and getting the nomination that he couldn't stay steady for the art. A bit later on, after having not just won the nomination, but the election, there's a piece of an American flag. He raises that here in Philadelphia on February 22nd, 1861, George Washington's birthday, as part of a observation of, we think of it today, President's Day, and it's 2 weeks before he takes office as president. When Lincoln raises that flag, he gives a speech that says he would sooner be assassinated on that spot than abandon the principles of liberty established in the Declaration of Independence. What language there. And Lincoln, as he's raising that flag and delivering that speech, 7 states have already said, we're out of here. We are not going to stick around and wait for his inauguration. We are severing our bonds with the United States government and forming a new Confederate States of America. Before I move along, I want to see if I can get a good shot for this for you folks. I love the image. There's an illustration of President Lincoln raising that flag. We can see this here. Let's see here. There you are, Abe. Great look at him there. This is an engraving that would reproduce the image in newspapers. There are actually some photos of President Lincoln on stage at Independence Hall on that day. There they are, however, as you can expect for a group shot in a 160-year-old photo, they're kind of blurry. Now, why are these states seceding? What is their argument? Well, Lincoln and many of those argue that they are fighting the war when this breaks out to preserve the Union. As late as 1862, September 1862, Lincoln is writing to the newspaper publisher Horace Greeley that if he could save the Union without freeing anyone, or by freeing everyone, or by freeing some and not others, he would do any of those in order to preserve the Union. That is not his main priority, ending slavery. On the other hand, the Confederate States are very clear from the beginning. This is Mississippi's Declaration of Secession. Let me get you a good look at that here. It's the first sentence, or the second sentence of the statement. So they begin their declaration of why they are seceding with, our petition is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. And they're not alone. South Carolina, the first state to secede, writes and quotes the Constitution and the 4th article, the Fugitive Slave Clause, that reference to people held to service or labor, saying that many northern states are not following, not abiding by it, and are not cooperating with the federal government to return people who have escaped to freedom back into enslavement. South Carolina actually also goes as far as to say in its declaration, it quotes Abraham Lincoln's House Divided speech, where they said this man has been elected who says that the nation cannot endure half slave and half free. And they don't want to find out which half is going to win out. By a couple of years into the war, Lincoln's position changes, however, and it does become much more aggressively anti-slavery. He would announce on September 22nd, 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation. It's 100 days before the new year. He is giving these southern states 100 days to end the rebellion, or he will use his war powers given by the Constitution to declare anybody held enslaved to be free. He views it as a necessary war effort. And why does he say it's necessary? Well, this is the backbone of the Southern economy. Mississippi is a state where the majority of people who live there are enslaved. The people who declared their secession from the U.S. said that slavery is the greatest material interest of the world. It says that the world's economy depends upon slave labor. If they're admitting this, he says, okay, the way to secure this, to win the war, to end the rebellion, is going to be to end slavery. And so we can see this. He gives these states 100 days. This is, by the way, a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation that was signed by President Lincoln here in Philadelphia in June of 1864. So it starts by saying, whereas on the 22nd day of September, saying, yes, I have announced previously that Well, in 100 days, any places that are still in rebellion, all persons enslaved will be thenceforward and forever free. Then he gets into this. He says, okay, I, Abraham Lincoln, and quoting the Constitution, saying, as President of the United States, by virtue of the power vested in me as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in a time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States. So he's following through. He's actually spelling out even where it applies. Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, exempting parts of Louisiana that are under federal control and more. This is key. And this is also with the Juneteenth holiday this week, one of the things we're observing. Because on June 19th, 1865, 2.5 years after Abraham Lincoln issues this proclamation, General Gordon Granger delivers General Orders number 3, declaring to the people of Texas, who are mentioned here, that this proclamation applies to them, notifying them of this presidential proclamation. And in that quote, in that general order from General Granger, he says that they are free and that there's a state of, he says, absolute equality between those who had previously been slave and master. So I really think about Juneteenth as well as fulfilling the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation, of the 2.5 years it takes from when President Lincoln signs it into action to when it actually takes effect in the farthest reaches of the Confederacy. But the other big deal that this Emancipation Proclamation does is that it declares and makes known such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed forces of the United States. This opens up the military service to African American men, and tens of thousands of them answer the call to serve. One other reference, looking at the signature here of President Lincoln and signatures of John Nicolay and Secretary Seward, he doesn't usually sign A. Abraham Lincoln. He usually signs A. Lincoln, but these ones were auctioned off to cover veterans care. Part of the U.S. Sanitary Commission held this great central fair, and Lincoln would have signed 4 dozen of these in order to raise funds. And so he gives this big, bold, full name in his signature there. Now, as I make my way through the exhibit here, this section has a lot of features on the experiences of those who were serving in wartime, looking at some of the items that would have belonged to folks serving. I'll see if I can get a good look at some of these. A few are items that are portraits, inkwells. I always love these letters that we have here that belong to Carlton Burt, where he would doodle on. Right now, we've got an image of a cabin that he would have stayed in. Other times, he has images of the exercises they were being instructed to do, or of people being arrested for trying to run away from their service. Other items include musical instruments, books, diary entries, a copy of the New Testament, a bullet which includes saved the life, a pocket watch case was struck by a bullet and saved Captain Faring's life. And then some of the more mundane items that may not have saved someone's life, but could have been there to preserve it in a state of hunger. Or, I suppose, well, being dirty a little bit, that bar of soap that has survived, or one of my favorite items in the thing, hardtack. I wonder if I can get a little bit closer there. Kind of blurry. Looks like a giant saltine, one of these meals ready to eat that has survived, and it firstly still survives today. Other items on the home front would help to bring what was going on or the events were to regular folks, including kids and students. One of my favorite items in here is a recreation we have of a board game, the game of secession, or sketches of rebellion, that was made here in Philadelphia in 1862. It's basically a pro-union version of Chutes and Ladders. Game of secession, sketches of rebellion. As you make your way through, there'll be information about the northern and southern causes, and you can really drive home which side the maker of this game is on, because if you land on the Confederate flag, you go back 96 spaces. So this is all consuming. This is dividing the country on a scale never before seen and not seen since. And there are questions of what should happen next when the war ends. There are schools established. The case here would have some of these informational books that are set up, other efforts to provide for job training, or even proposals like, say, General Order 15 from William Tecumseh Sherman that would have said, and let's see if I can get a good look at this line here. Ooh, get very zoomed in. This is one that would mention the land. We can see here, shall have selected for that purpose. Very bottom text there, 40 acres of tillable ground. Each family shall have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground. That line referenced the 40 acres of the mule, of compensation, of reparations for folks who served, who had been enslaved. General Sherman, that was his idea. His army had marched through Georgia. He mentions in that language from Hilton Head in the Sea Islands in South Carolina, along the coast into 30 miles inland down to the St. Johns River in Florida, essentially Jacksonville, St. Augustine area. That's a pretty huge area. Ultimately, this proposal, this general order by Sherman, does not see enforcement. It does not hold up through a series of suits from former landowners and the like. But this is still seen as a promise made to many who have advocated what could be done to see that free men and women could be on equal footing, truly equal footing. And it's often the arguments were land and the ballot, the right to vote. And this is the big question of what are we going to do next? How do we bring this country back together? Thaddeus Stevens, as we get to Reconstruction, has a quote saying, "Our fathers have been compelled to postpone the principles of their great declaration until a more propitious time, which ought to be right now." That we have these grand ideals the country is founded on. All men are created equal. They have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we haven't really seen them for everyone. But this is the chance to do it. And so this is what we'll see here in this Reconstruction period. Now, early in 1865, an amendment is submitted to the states, the 13th Amendment. And this is a lot going on here. See if I can get a good look at this. There's two parts to this. This would be an original submitted to the states. Every state would get a official engrossed copy of an amendment. This one first is going to be signed by Secretary of State Seward, a statement of this amendment submitted that has passed Congress going out to the states. We can see here, February 1865. The rest of it is going to be this handwritten text of the amendment itself. Let's see here, a resolution submitting to the legislatures of the several states a proposition to amend the Constitution of the United States, resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America, in Congress assembled. All right, here we go. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. It goes on to the next page there. This is an original 13th Amendment. And this amendment is transformative. It is the first amendment to the Constitution in 61 years. And it is the first time the word slavery appears in the Constitution, and it is added there to end it. As said, we have features in this exhibit that get into, is there a loophole in the 13th or the 14th or the 15th Amendment? And think of that quote again, slavery or involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. As we would see starting in the Reconstruction era and then in years to follow, that language was often exploited. Many states had what were called black codes, where there would be work requirements, there would be curfews in place, restrictions on where one could live or how someone could travel. Many of these were easy to be convicted of and could be exploited to arrest and convict Black men and women and sentence them to labor. And then some states continued this with the convict leasing system, where they might be hired out and their labor would be hired out to work on all sorts of forms of manual labor, performing what some said was slavery in all but name. Around the time that this amendment is making its way through the states, the nation faces a great tragedy of the like it had never seen before. And we see here the quote along the wall. I'll move back to just get this in the text. Quote from the New Orleans Black Republican, the name of the newspaper. April 14th will be a day of memorable, an act of atrocity with no parallel in the annals of men. This is the assassination of President Lincoln, just 5 days after the surrender of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Lincoln is at Ford Theater seeing Our American Cousin. This play here, we see mentioning it there. And he is shot by John Wilkes Booth, a member of a well-known acting family throughout the United States. Booth is part of a conspiracy that intends to not only take out President Lincoln, but other members of the federal government. The same night that Booth assassinates Lincoln, there's an attempt on the life of Secretary of State Seward. Eventually, Booth is killed before he is captured. We see his image there, but David Harold is executed, as well as Lewis Powell, Mary Surratt, and George Atzerodt. So this is something that's really striking. And with the death of Lincoln, what is going to happen? Who is going to help oversee the enforcement of Reconstruction and this reuniting of the country and remaking of the country? And the answer is going to be this fellow here, Andrew Johnson. He was not Lincoln's first vice president. He takes office in March of 1865, but he's not been in office long. He was a senator from Tennessee. He was one of the only, I believe, the only senator from the state that secedes, that remains loyal to the Union. But he is, nevertheless, even if he had been opposed to the secession movement, he is also opposed to Black suffrage or to racial equality. He is an avowed white supremacist, stating that he felt this is a white man's country. Vetoes pieces of legislation, including civil rights actions, many of which are overridden by Congress. And he issues a number of pardons. We can see some of them here. This one pardoning gentleman Edward Gay of Louisiana for his part in the rebellion. And he was seen as much more lenient than many in Congress had hoped for or expected for the Confederacy and former Confederate leaders. These clashes between Congress and President Johnson take place throughout his presidency. In 1866, the campaign he makes on behalf of Democratic candidates, at the same time that there are massacres of Black men seeking to vote in Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans, Louisiana. By 1868, he is ultimately impeached by Congress for violating the Tenure of Office Act that the Senate and the House attempted to prevent him from replacing Lincoln's cabinet with his own. The Constitution says the president needs the advice and consent of the Senate to appoint cabinet officials. They passed the law saying he needs their approval to remove them as well. He does it anyway, firing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, which triggers his impeachment, and he avoids removal by just a single vote. Now, as we're making our way through, I wanted to point out some of the Black codes, the rise of these actions to try to limit the scope of freedom and what that would mean. Many recognize that more needs to be done, that we need additional steps. Ending slavery alone will not be enough. The quote on the wall behind me is one from the convention, the Colored Citizens of Norfolk, Virginia, a group of men who had attempted to vote a short while after the surrender of Lee's army in May of 1865, have been denied, and then organized a convention where they put together these statements that they are still defenseless before their enemies. They need more protection. And they announced themselves and these intentions with the phrase, fellow citizens, the first two words to this statement. They are not alone. Conventions take place around the South of free Black men gathering to identify as citizens and call for the federal government to step in and secure their rights. This one from Alabama in 1867. We claim exactly the same rights, privileges, and immunities, blurry there, as are enjoyed by white men, ask for nothing more, and will be content with nothing less. And so this is going to lead to the 14th Amendment. It's a much more expansive amendment. The 13th is relatively brief in its language. The 14th, however, is going to have a number of facets to it. The best known portion of it is actually Section 1. We have it all on the wall over here. You can see this, the most cited part of the U.S. Constitution in federal court decisions. We can see this text here. Let me see if I can get a good look at this for you folks. That all All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. This is essentially what Justice Benjamin Curtis was arguing 11 years earlier in the wake of that Dred Scott decision. And no state shall make or enforce any law which will abridge the privileges and immunities of citizenship, which shall any state deny any person of life, liberty, or property. Thaddeus Stevens saying to write these principles of the Declaration into the Constitution. That's very close. And then to say that people cannot be denied, any person within the jurisdiction, the equal protection of the law. This is really key in shaping the Constitution, these ideas of what we think it means to be a citizen and what rights, what protections come along with it. This empowers the incorporation of the Bill of Rights in generations to come. There's a lot to be said for this 14th Amendment. But even then, the 14th Amendment alone is, many feel, not enough, not a big enough change. Think about this. Yes, there's a Constitution that says that all persons are citizens, that we are supposed to be treated equally, that we cannot be denied life, liberty, and property. But if you do not have the right to vote for who is writing these laws or enforcing these laws or affecting, cannot vote for those who would appoint the folks who would interpret these laws. These are not guaranteed. And so we can see this, that same Norfolk statement, give us the suffrage and you may rely upon us to secure justice for ourselves. That the right to vote could secure all of these other freedoms. And so the 15th Amendment is ratified in 1870. It's a simple one. It says the right to vote shall not be denied of citizens shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And these Reconstruction amendments, they are again not without their loopholes or their challenges. The 14th Amendment introduces the word male into the Constitution for the first time. Section 2, states could lose votes in Congress and the Electoral College for denying male citizens over 21 the right to vote, except for rebellion or crimes committed. So it essentially says it's okay to deny women the right to vote. And then the 15th is not as expansive. Does not only says race is not a reason you can be denied, not other reasons. So the suffrage movement, and we can see some features on some of these folks here. Stanton and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony opposed the amendment. Others like Lucy Stone or Frances Harper support it. And so we see a fracturing of should we support these steps? What should be done? There's another loophole too, that the amendment is not what we call an affirmative right to vote. It does not say that all people have the right to vote. It says that you cannot be told no on account of your race, but you could be told no for other reasons. And in the years, especially after what is seen as the end of Reconstruction, many states come up with reasons for this. In this case here, we have a couple of poll tax receipts from Texas from 1923. These cost $1.75. It's about, I believe, $27 or so in 2023 money, converted for inflation. It's not a princely sum. It's not unaffordable for everyone, but it's certainly enough to discourage folks. And then many states would have exemptions. Some of them would be grandfathered. If your grandfather could vote, you don't have to pay the tax. Well, whose grandfathers were not able to vote because they were not recognized as citizens? That said, we do see a lot of success, especially for the brief period really where Reconstruction takes place. Roughly, most historians say about an 11-year period, hundreds, even thousands of African American men are elected to public office, more than 1,500. We have an interactive where you can see state by state what offices are held by Black men. Some are elected to the Senate, to the House of Representatives. And you see many states have really representative government, or a government that is more representative of the people who live there than ever before in American history. And still, we see the decline of Reconstruction. And how does this all end? How do we see this begin to be chipped away at? Often we see an 1877 year, but it's really tough to say that there's any one moment that would be the end of Reconstruction. And a lot of folks will think of it as a failure. It's more of a series of small defeat, that it was a organized campaign to prevent a lot of the achievements from Reconstruction from enduring. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, the White Leagues, Red Shirts in South Carolina, and others would have organized terror campaigns to prevent elected office holders or prominent Black landowners from becoming the successful pillars of the community, to intimidate them, to drive them away, and more. We would see a number of other actions taken by where they could, when those who are redeemers, who want to redeem the Old South and restore it, would take steps to prevent full equality. Once in power, there are efforts as part of the Lost Cause campaign to rewrite or reframe that history of what the war was about. Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy controlling textbooks, popular books and film like Gone with the Wind, or the movie The Birth of a Nation, which would reframe who were the heroes of the war and what was it really all about. And in the end, there'd even be court decisions like Crookshank versus United States, which essentially rules against those who wanted to prosecute, or you thought the federal government could prosecute a mob that had massacred dozens of Black men in Colfax, Louisiana in 1872. That because these were independent citizens, private actors, and not the state, the 14th Amendment did not apply to them. That local laws would have to see to their prosecution. Other decisions would say that discrimination based on race is permitted by private individuals. And then in 1896, by public officials, by schools, by trains, and more, separate but equal in that Plessy versus Ferguson decision. And so this was the challenge for the next century: is what does this freedom mean? The quote from Frederick Douglass here, from the Republican National Convention in 1876. You say you have emancipated us. You have, and I thank you for it. But what is your emancipation? Mentioning that you have turned us loose to the sky, the storm, the whirlwind, and to the wrath of our infuriated master. That there was more work to be done. And it continued and would fall to the future generations. In the exhibit here at the end, we follow essentially the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Right here we have scenes from the March on Washington in 1963. President Johnson, prior to issuing the Civil Rights Act and signing that into law. And then the March on the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. These efforts were actually to secure rights which have already been enshrined in the Constitution, see that they would be fully protected, and that we can live up to these promises of the Constitution to establish justice and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. I know I've gone on for quite a bit, Madison. I don't know if our friends have anything they wanted to share in the chat, or if you think there's anything anyone would like us to go back and see. Otherwise, I do want to thank everyone for joining us. And I have one more thing I might mention too, Madison. In the exhibit, tricky for me to feature this, we have another interactive called In Their Own Words, which features interviews from formerly enslaved men and women conducted in the 1930s and 40s by the Works Progress Administration. And one of those is an interview with Laura Smalley, who was enslaved in Galveston, Texas in 1865. And so it's a firsthand account of essentially her experiences on Juneteenth, on that original Juneteenth. So there we go. Thank you, Madison, for sharing that one. If our friends have any other questions, we are certainly happy to help and stick around for a couple more minutes. But otherwise, we want to thank you folks for joining us and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And if we don't see you again, wonderful rest of your summer.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Madison. And I know I'll see you before. Happy 4th of July to you soon, coming up.
Yes, absolutely. And friends, Brian will be leading another tour the day after, July 5th. And we're going to have a little bit of an emphasis during that tour about Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." So great connections to everything that Brian has talked about during this tour. So that's going to be a wonderful program to check out. We're also going to have a scholar that day, live stream an event where she's going to unpack a little bit about Frederick Douglass's life and legacy. And then we're going to have one of our amazing actors at the National Constitution Center read a portion of Douglass's speech. So it's a great way to kick off the 4th. And we're really excited for you to join us. But Brian, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I think you answered all of our questions. So thank you. And then, yeah, absolutely. And Brian, I'll leave it to you to close out. But friends, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Brian.
Thank you folks so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak to you about history and the Constitution, and we really look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, folks. Have a great day.